The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a flyer for a new pesticide and the county tax assessment. It wasn't in a normal envelope. It was a stiff, cream-colored packet delivered by a courier who needed a signature, a man whose polished city shoes looked hilariously out of place on my dusty porch. I signed with a hand still caked with dirt from replanting the Westfield fence posts. The logo in the corner was one I knew too well, a stylized green leaf twisting into a double helix. Omnigen. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the kitchen table, a sterile rectangle of corporate paper on the worn, scarred oak my grandfather had built the table from. I made coffee. I watched the sun crawl higher over the eastern fields, turning the dew on the corn leaves into a million tiny prisms of light. For 4 generations, my family had watched that same sun rise over this same land. We weren't just on it, we were in it. The soil was a living ledger of our sweat, our failures, our triumphs, and for the past decade, Omnigen had been trying to buy that ledger. They started friendly, polite men in suits offering impossible sums of money, talking about unlocking the land's potential, as if 100 years of cultivation was just a placeholder for their grand vision. My father always sent them away with a calm, polite no. After he passed, they came to me. The offers got higher, the smiles tighter, the politeness strained. I always gave the same answer. This farm wasn't a commodity. It was a covenant. When the offers didn't work, they started buying everything around me. A slow, methodical siege. The Miller farm to the west, the Garcia acreage to the south, one by one, the family names that had been my neighbors for my entire life were replaced by the single, monolithic brand of Omnigen. They built vast, sterile greenhouses and fields of unnaturally uniform crops that grew under the eerie purple glow of LED lights at night. I became an island of traditional agriculture in a sea of industrial science, a stubborn, 300-acre speck of green defiance. Finally, I picked up the packet. My hands were clean now, but they trembled slightly. I slit the envelope with a paring knife. The language inside was dense, a thicket of legal jargon, but the message was brutally simple. They were suing me. Patent infringement. Their lawyers, from a firm with a name like a pantheon of gods, claimed my corn was cross-pollinating with their patented Titan 7 strain, their golden goose, a genetically modified crop engineered for drought resistance and pest immunity. They claimed my heirloom corn, the Solstice Queen as my great-grandmother named it, was contaminating their intellectual property. The absurdity of it was staggering. It was like the ocean suing a river for pouring into it. My corn was open-pollinated, its genetic story told by the wind and the bees for over a century. Theirs was a sterile creation, born in a lab, yet here they were accusing my heritage of stealing from their invention. The letter was a masterpiece of condescending legalese. It spoke of genetic drift, uncontrolled propagation, and infringement liability. It suggested a simple solution: cease and desist all cultivation of my infringing crop, destroy my current harvest, and sell the land to them for a fair market price to settle the matter without a protracted and costly legal battle they were certain to win. They thought they could bankrupt me into submission. They thought they could bury me in depositions and discovery motions, until I surrendered the last piece of my family's legacy. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. This wasn't a business negotiation. This was an extinction event. They weren't just trying to take my farm. They were trying to erase it from the map, to plow my history under and plant their own sterile, profitable future on top. I looked out the window, past the porch, to the rustling fields of Solstice Queen corn, its stalks heavy with ears of deep reds, blues, and golds. They had no idea what they had just done. Their lawyers, in their high-rise offices, had researched my finances, my crop yields, my water rights. They had done their due diligence on Lynette Vance, the 4th-generation farmer, but they had failed to discover the one thing that mattered. They had failed to research Alara Vance, my great-grandmother, and they had no earthly idea what was sleeping in the cool, dark earth beneath my house. They thought they were suing me over a few acres of corn. They were about to find out they had picked a fight with history itself, and history, I was beginning to realize, had been waiting for this fight for a very long time. It helps, when you're facing the abyss, to know you're not just screaming into the void. It's why we tell these stories. If you've ever felt the ground crumble beneath your feet because a giant decided you were in its way, let me know in the comments below. Your story matters, and it helps me to know I'm not alone. The first 24 hours after the letter arrived are a blur of cold, quiet fury. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The emotion was too deep, too vast for that. It was a pressure building behind my eyes, a heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. I walked the perimeter of my farm, my boots sinking into the same earth my father and his mother had walked. Every fence post was a memory. Every furrow in the soil was a line in a story I knew by heart. The lawsuit felt like a violation, a desecration. They weren't just claiming my corn was theirs, they were claiming my very air, the pollen on the breeze, was subject to their corporate will. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I went to the barn. Not the new, functional steel one we built in the 90s, but the old one, the original one. It was built from timber, cleared from this very land, the beams scarred with the marks of hand-hewn tools. The air inside was thick with the scent of old hay, dust, and time. It smelled like my childhood. It smelled like my father. I sat on a bale of hay, the legal papers a venomous weight in my lap, and I let the silence of the place hold me. It was in that silence that the despair finally hit. It was a crushing weight. The sheer scale of Omnigin was suffocating. They were a nation-state of agriculture. They had armies of lawyers, bottomless coffers, and lobbyists in Washington. I was one woman with a mortgaged farm and a line of credit at the local co-op. The fight was a joke. It was designed to be unwinnable. They would bleed me dry, drown me in paperwork, and my only choice would be to sign their papers, take their pittance, and walk away from the only home I had ever known. And for a moment, in the deep, dark quiet of that barn, I considered it. Maybe this was just the way of the world. Maybe the story of the family farm was over, a quaint chapter in a history book, and my struggle was nothing but the last, twitching nerve of a dead dream. My hands shook, not from cold, but from a profound, bone-deep weariness. And then, I remembered. Flashbacks aren't like in the movies. They don't come in cinematic sweeps. They're fragments, shards of memory that pierce the present. I saw my father's hands, calloused and strong, showing me how to test the soil's pH with a simple kit. I heard his voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, telling me, "The land remembers, Lynette. You treat it with respect, and it will give you everything you need." He wasn't just talking about harvests. He was talking about strength, about resilience. He had been the first one to see the storm coming. When Omnigen's first polite representatives came knocking, my father had listened patiently, then walked them to the edge of the property. He pointed to a small, gnarled oak tree. He said, "My grandmother planted that from an acorn the day I was born. You can't put a price on that, so thank you for your offer, but this land is not for sale." They had smiled their thin, corporate smiles, not understanding a word of what he truly meant. They saw sentimentality. He was talking about roots. A few years later, the CEO himself came. Sterling Thorne. He arrived in a black car that looked like it had been carved from a block of obsidian. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a tan that didn't come from working under the sun. It came from a yacht. He had a way of looking at my farm not as a living place, but as an asset on a balance sheet that needed to be liquidated. He walked through my fields, his expensive shoes getting dusty, and he talked about synergy and vertical integration. He condescended to me, calling my farm charming and a lovely hobby. He patted one of the ears of Solstice Queen corn, its kernels gleaming like jewels. He said, "You know, with our technology, we could make this field 5 times as profitable." I remember the feeling of a quiet heat flushing up my neck. I told him, "Profit isn't the only thing you can harvest from a field, Mr. Thorne." He had laughed, a short, sharp bark. "It's the only one that matters in the end, Lynette. The only one that matters." He left his card. I used it to level a wobbly leg on the potting bench. Then came the siege. The land around me sold. The familiar landscapes of my youth were bulldozed and replaced with Omnigen's monotonous, industrial perfection. The night sky, once a brilliant, star-dusted canvas, was now tainted by the perpetual, unnatural twilight of their grow lights. I felt like a museum piece, the last exhibit in a forgotten wing. And my promise, the memory that cut the deepest. My father, in his last days, his big frame withered by illness, his voice a dry whisper. He made me sit with him on the porch, looking out at the fields. He didn't ask me to be a great farmer. He didn't ask me to be rich or successful. He held my hand, his grip surprisingly firm, and said, "Protect the source, Lynette. Don't let them have the source. Everything else is just branches and leaves. The source is all that matters." I had promised, a sacred vow made in the shadow of impending loss, and now I was failing. I was letting them take it all. The despair in the barn began to curdle, to change shape. It was solidifying, cooling, hardening into something else. It was no longer a weight crushing me. It was becoming armor. This transformation was cemented by a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. The shared last name with the OmniGen CEO was a cosmic joke we often acknowledged with a wry smile. They were third cousins, a fact Eris found deeply embarrassing. He was nothing like his corporate relative. Eris was a geneticist, a brilliant, passionate, and deeply ethical scientist who had found his way to my farm 3 years earlier. He had been doing his doctoral research on landrace crops, heirloom varieties cultivated and adapted by indigenous or traditional communities. He'd heard about my solstice queen corn and had come to see it, expecting a quaint hobby. He found something else entirely. He found my great-grandmother's legacy. He found the seed bank. I took him down to the cellar beneath the old farmhouse. It wasn't just a root cellar. Behind a heavy oak door was a small, dry, climate-controlled room. My great-grandfather had built to his wife's exacting specifications. On shelves lining the walls were hundreds of clay pots, each sealed with wax, each with a small handwritten tag. They contained seeds, a living library of my family's work, stretching back to the late 8th. Eris had stared at it all, his mouth slightly agape. He wasn't looking at old seeds. He was looking at a treasure trove of untapped genetic diversity. He asked to see the records. I brought him the journals. My great-grandmother, Alara Vance, had not been just a farmer. She had been a self-taught scientist, a botanist of formidable talent. Her journals weren't diaries, they were lab notebooks. She documented every cross-pollination, every new trait that emerged. Color, size, resistance to blight, sweetness. She drew the plants with an artist's eye and a biologist's precision. Eris had practically begged me to let him study them. He said, "Lynette, this isn't just family history. This is a scientific miracle. People at universities would kill for a dataset this clean, this extensive, stretching back this far." His university, I knew, was heavily funded by OmniGen. It was a fact that sat uneasily between us. But I trusted Eris. There was an earnestness to him, a genuine reverence for the work Alara had done. So for the past 3 years, Eris had spent his weekends and holidays at my farm, carefully cataloging the seeds, digitizing Alara's journals, and running genetic sequencing on samples from the oldest seeds in the bank. He was doing it on his own time, using university equipment under the guise of an independent research project. He was my secret weapon, though neither of us knew what war we were preparing for. His own motivations ran deep. His mentor, a celebrated professor of plant genetics, had had his life's work stolen by a large corporation years ago. They had patented his discoveries and left him with nothing but a legal bill and a broken spirit. Eris saw OmniGen as the embodiment of that corporate rapaciousness. Helping me was for him a quiet act of justice for his mentor. It was his own private war. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from the hay bale and the memories. It was Eris. His voice was tight, urgent. He said, "Lynette, I heard a rumor that OmniGen was making a move on you. Is it true?" I told him about the letter. I could hear him swear under his breath. He said, Okay, listen. Don't panic. I think I found something. I've been running a deeper sequence analysis on your solstice queen, comparing it against the public patent database. It's not just similar to their Titan 7, Lynette. It's the parent, the direct, undeniable ancestor. I was silent, my knuckles white on the phone. He continued, his words tumbling out. They didn't invent anything, Lynette. They just isolated a drought-resistant gene that was already present in the diverse genome of your family's corn. It's a trait your great-grandmother noted in her journal in 1923, after a particularly dry summer. She called it the stubborn gene. They found it, turned a patent key on it, and claimed they had invented the whole damn car. That was it. That was the spark. The words of my father echoed in my mind. Protect the source. And then another memory, a detail from Alara's journal, a note I had read 100 times but never truly understood. After describing the stubborn gene, she had written a single cryptic sentence. The source is the power. I stood up, the legal papers falling to the dusty floor of the barn. The despair was gone. Every trace of it burned away. In its place was a cold, clear certainty that felt like steel crystallizing in my veins. They thought this was the end of my story. They thought they were closing the book on the Vance farm. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of history and resolve. They hadn't closed the book. They had just given me the reason to finally write the last chapter. And it wasn't going to be the story they were expecting. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. A correction to the historical, and now legal, record. Omnigen's mistake was assuming I was a victim. They saw a small farmer, isolated and financially vulnerable. They saw an easy target. They never imagined that for the past 3 years, my farm hadn't just been a farm. It had been a laboratory and a war room. My foresight, if you can call it that, wasn't born from a single moment of genius. It was a slow dawning realization, a strategy that grew organically, like the corn in my fields. It started with my father. After the first few buyout offers, he saw the pattern. He knew they wouldn't stop. He said to me one evening, "If you want to beat a machine, you can't use a shovel. You have to understand the gears." That's when we started the project. We didn't just keep farming, we started documenting. We treated every season, every harvest, every seed saved as evidence. We were building a case without knowing what the charges would be. After he was gone, I continued it, and bringing Eris into the fold was the final, crucial piece. He was the one who could translate my family's story into the language our opponents would understand, the cold, hard language of data. While Omnigen was busy buying up the land around me, Eris and I were building a fortress of information. We had my great-grandmother's handwritten journals, a century-old chronicle of meticulous, peerless agricultural science. We had the physical proof, the seed bank, a chain of custody for our intellectual property that was literally rooted in the earth. And now we had Eris's genetic analysis, the digital Rosetta Stone that connected Alara Vance's stubborn gene directly to Omnigen's billion-dollar Titan 7 patent. My first call wasn't back to Omnigen's lawyers. It was to a woman named Isabella Alvarez. Ms. Alvarez was a lawyer in the county seat, but that description is woefully inadequate. She was a force of nature crammed into a sensible pantsuit. She was in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for legally disemboweling corporate bullies who tried to push around the local farmers and small business owners. She had represented my father in a water rights dispute 20 years ago, and had won so decisively that the state regulators were still wary of her. She operated out of a dusty, book-filled office above the town bakery. She answered her own phone. I went to see her the next morning. I brought the letter from Omnigen. I also brought a heavy box containing 3 of Alara's journals, Aris's preliminary genetic report, and a small sealed jar of solstice queen seeds. I laid it all out on her big mahogany desk. She read the Omnigen letter first, her expression growing thunderous. She let out a low whistle. "They're not just trying to push you out, Lynette," she said, her voice a gravelly rasp. "This is a kill shot. They want to salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again." Then she picked up Eris's report. She read it slowly, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't a geneticist, but she was fluent in the logic of evidence. She cross-referenced his findings with the notes in Alara's journals, her finger tracing the elegant, century-old script. For a full 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the rustle of paper and the distant rumble of the bakery's dough mixer. Finally, she leaned back in her creaking leather chair and looked at me. A slow smile spread across her face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just caught the scent of its favorite prey.
Well, I'll be, she whispered, the arrogant fools.
She explained the legal landscape to me. Patent law, especially concerning plants and genes, is a murky swamp. You can't patent a product of nature, but you can patent a plant or a gene if you've significantly modified it or isolated it from its natural state and found a new, non-obvious utility for it. That's the loophole Omnigen had built their empire on. They'll argue, Ms. Alvarez said, that even if your great-grandmother discovered this trait, they were the ones who isolated the specific gene, patented its function, and inserted it into a new host organism. They'll claim they invented the application, not the source. It was a debatable point, the kind of legal gray area that could keep lawyers paid for a decade. It was the kind of plausible inaccuracy in the system that corporations exploit. They count on the fact that most people can't afford to debate it. But, she continued, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming, we're not just going to argue about prior art. That's defense. I'm not interested in defense. She tapped a section of Eris's report. This changes things. This isn't just a case of them patenting something that already existed. If we can prove they knew it existed and that they took it without permission, then it's not just an invalid patent, it's fraud. That's when I told her the final piece of the story, the one Eris had uncovered just a few weeks before the lawsuit hit. He had been digging into the history of Omnigen's R&D on the Titan 7 project, looking for any connection back to our region. He found it. A research paper from 12 years ago, published by a junior Omnigen scientist named Dr. Marcus Thorne, another distant and far more compliant cousin of the CEO. The paper was about bioprospecting for resilient traits in North American landrace maize varieties. It was dry, academic, and buried in an obscure journal, but in the appendix there was a map of collection sites, and one of the pins was dropped right on my family's farm. I went back to my father's old farm logs, the daily diaries he kept of everything that happened on the property. And there it was, an entry from July 12th, 12 years ago. Visit from a Dr. Thorne, a historian from the university. Seems like a nice young man, interested in Granny Alara's corn. I showed him the fields, gave him some samples for his research. He was very grateful. My father, in his open, trusting nature, had handed our family's crown jewels to the enemy. He thought he was helping a historian. He was actually enabling a thief. And that thief's name, Dr. Marcus Thorne, was listed as the lead inventor on the patent for Titan 7. Ms. Alvarez slammed her hand down on the desk, rattling a cup full of pens. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure, righteous fury. That's it, she said. That's the ball game. They didn't discover it. They stole it. They committed fraud on the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and they're using that fraudulent patent to try and steal your farm. Our plan began to take shape, not as a defense, but as a full-scale assault. It wasn't about waiting for their move. It was about taking the board away from them. Step 1. We would respond to their lawsuit, of course. But our response would be a countersuit of devastating proportions. We would sue for theft of intellectual property, fraudulent patent procurement, and punitive damages that would make their shareholders' hair stand on end. Step 2. We would simultaneously file a petition for an ex parte re-examination of U.S. Patent 9876543 with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. We would present our evidence, Alara's journals as prior art, the genetic sequencing, and the farm log proving the theft, and argue that the patent should never have been granted in the first place. Step 3, and this was Ms. Alvarez's masterstroke, was about leverage. A lawsuit takes time, she said. We need to hit them where they feel it now, their bottom line. Omnigen didn't just sell Titan 7 corn. Their primary business model was licensing the Titan 7 genetic technology to other massive seed companies around the globe. Those licensing agreements were their lifeblood. The plan was audacious, terrifying, and beautiful in its brutal simplicity. We weren't just going to defend my farm, we were going to dismantle their empire with the truth. As I left her office, the smell of baking bread wafting up from downstairs, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I had my allies, Eris, the brilliant scientist driven by a quiet code of honor, and Miss Alvarez, the legal warrior who lived for this kind of fight. I had my hidden leverage, 100 years of history, science, and truth stored in clay pots and handwritten journals. I drove home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields. I passed the glowing, sterile complexes of Omnigen. They looked different now, not monolithic and intimidating, but brittle, fragile. They had built a glass castle on a stolen foundation, and I was about to show them that my great-grandmother had left me the blueprints, the real ones. The first move was made in silence. There was no press conference, no angry public statement. Miss Alvarez believed in the power of a quiet ambush. On a Wednesday morning, a courier, just as professional as the one who had visited me, walked into the gleaming marble lobby of Omnigen's corporate headquarters and delivered our countersuit to their legal department. Simultaneously, Miss Alvarez electronically filed our petition for re-examination with the USPTO. It was done. The first stones had been thrown. Now, we just had to wait for the ripples. According to Eris, who had a network of friends and former colleagues throughout the biotech world, the initial reaction at Omnigen was laughter. He heard from a friend in their R&D department that Sterling Thorne had personally circulated our filing at a senior staff meeting as a piece of comic relief, a nuisance suit from a crazy farm lady. They saw our claims of 100-year-old journals and a secret seed bank as folksy nonsense, the ramblings of a desperate woman trying to throw mud at a skyscraper. They assigned the case to a junior legal associate. They were arrogant, they were dismissive, and they were fools. The laughter stopped about 48 hours later. That's when their own internal patent counsel and their senior geneticists must have actually read Eris's report. It wasn't folksy nonsense, it was a meticulously documented, scientifically rigorous analysis, complete with genomic sequence alignments and statistical probabilities that were, in Eris's words, mathematically undeniable. The report didn't just claim my Solstice Queen was the ancestor of their Titan 7, it showed the receipts, mapping the exact genetic markers that had been lifted from my family's corn. Suddenly, it wasn't a nuisance suit anymore. It was a 5-alarm fire in the heart of their intellectual property portfolio. Eris's friend told him the atmosphere in the R&D labs changed overnight. There were hushed, frantic meetings behind closed doors. The junior associate was abruptly replaced by the firm's top litigation team, and they started digging into their own history. They started looking for the work of Dr. Marcus Thorne. They found his bioprospecting paper. They found his travel receipts from a trip to my county 12 years ago. They probably pulled the original lab notebooks from the Titan 7 project. And somewhere, in the methodical scrawl of their own scientist, they would have found the reference to the samples from the Vance farm. The panic began to set in. It wasn't a loud, screaming panic. It was a cold, corporate dread. Their entire empire was built on a lie, and someone had just handed the truth a megaphone. The first visible sign of their desperation was the quiet disappearance of Dr. Marcus Thorne. One day, his profile was on the company website, lauded as a pioneer of agricultural innovation. The next day, it was gone. His internal email account was deactivated. They were trying to erase their own smoking gun. Too late, we had already downloaded and archived everything. While they were scrambling to contain the internal damage, Ms. Alvarez executed the second part of our plan. She drafted a letter. It was a simple one-page document, a masterpiece of understated threat. It was addressed to the general counsels of the top 3 global agricultural companies that licensed the Titan 7 technology from Omnigen, corporations nearly as large as Omnigen itself. The letter was polite. It was professional. It simply stated that a legal dispute had arisen regarding the ownership and provenance of the intellectual property known as Titan 7. It mentioned our countersuit and our petition with the USPTO. It attached a copy of Eris's preliminary genetic report and the relevant pages from my father's farm log. The letter didn't demand anything. It didn't threaten them. It just informed them, as a professional courtesy, that the multi-million-dollar technology they were licensing might have been built on a foundation of fraud and theft, and that its patent was now under formal review for invalidation. She ended the letter with a sentence of pure, distilled legal poison. We simply wish to ensure you are fully apprised of the potential legal and commercial risks associated with the continued sale and distribution of products derived from this contested patent." She sent the letters via registered mail. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for Omnigen. These were not small companies. They had their own fierce legal departments and fiduciary duties to their shareholders. The whiff of a fraudulent patent was enough to send them running for cover. Within a week, all three of them had sent legal notice to Omnigen, placing their multi-million-dollar quarterly royalty payments in escrow pending the resolution of the legal dispute. Omnigen's primary revenue stream didn't just shrink, it was choked off. The news of the frozen royalties rippled through the financial world. You can't hide that kind of information from Wall Street. Omnigen's stock, which had been a pillar of stability for years, began to tremor. It dropped 5% in a single day. Then 10. Analysts started asking questions. Rumors of a foundational patent dispute began to circulate. Sterling Thorne issued a public statement, dismissing it all as a frivolous and baseless legal maneuver by a disgruntled landowner. But the market didn't buy it. The panic was no longer contained within their headquarters. It was public. This was when I truly understood the difference between their power and mine. Their power was based on money, on leverage, on intimidation. It was loud and brittle. My power was based on the truth. It was quiet, patient, and had been growing in the dark for 100 years. They had built a fortress on a floodplain, and the river of history was finally rising. They were beginning to drown. The desperation of a cornered predator is a dangerous thing. Sterling Thorne was a man who had built his career, his identity, on the idea of absolute control. He solved problems with dominance and dollars. The fact that my quiet, methodical strategy was dismantling his empire from the inside out was something his ego couldn't process. He couldn't fight me in the language of data and history, so he reverted to the only language he truly understood, brute force. One evening, just as the sun was setting, casting the fields in a warm golden light, his black car came down my long gravel driveway. It kicked up a cloud of dust, an angry intrusion into the evening peace. This time, he was alone. No lawyers, no assistants. He got out of the car, his expensive suit looking rumpled, his face strained. The practiced, easy confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged edge. He met me on the porch, where I was cleaning dirt from under my nails with the tip of a pocket knife. I didn't get up. I just watched him approach, my expression calm. I had been expecting this. It was the predictable move of a man with no other moves left to make. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "All right, Lynette," he said, his voice low and tight. "You've made your point. You've caused some trouble. It's a clever little scheme, I'll give you that." I just looked at him, saying nothing. The silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. "Let's end this," he said, trying to regain his footing, to re-establish the old power dynamic. "Name your price. I'm prepared to be very generous. We'll buy the farm, pay you a settlement that will let you live comfortably for the rest of your life. All you have to do is drop this ridiculous lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. This all just goes away." I finally spoke, my voice even and quiet. "It's not for sale, Mr. Thorne. I thought I made that clear." A flicker of disbelief, then rage, crossed his face. "Don't be a fool. This isn't a negotiation about the farm anymore. You have no idea what you're messing with. This is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I will bury you. I will drag your name, your family's name, through the mud. I will paint you as a liar, an extortionist. You think your little small-town lawyer can stand up to my firm? We will bankrupt you, your children, and your children's children." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly, but it had no power over me anymore. I had faced my own despair in the dark of the barn, and his manufactured anger was a pale imitation. I slowly closed my pocket knife and stood up, moving to the edge of the porch until I was standing almost level with him. I looked him directly in the eye. "You're right," I said softly. "I don't know the world you play in, the world of boardrooms and stock prices, but you're not in that world right now. You're in mine. You're standing on my land. And on my land, Mr. Thorne, the roots run deep, deeper than your money, deeper than your threats." I held his gaze. This was never about money. So you can take your checkbook and your threats, and you can get off my property. For the first time, I saw genuine shock in his eyes. He was a man who believed every problem had a price tag. The concept of a person who couldn't be bought was a foreign, terrifying language to him. He was rendered speechless. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he turned without another word, got back in his car and sped away, leaving another cloud of angry dust hanging in the twilight. The power had shifted. It wasn't a subtle tremor anymore. It was a tectonic realignment. He had come to my home to threaten me, to reassert his dominance. He had left defeated, stripped of his primary weapons. He didn't know it yet, but that conversation on my porch was the moment he lost the war. The exodus had already begun. The courtesy notices Ms. Alvarez had sent were working their slow, inexorable poison through the system. The licensees weren't just withholding royalties, they were activating the exit clauses in their contracts. They were preparing to abandon the Titan VII ship before it sank. The quiet, professional emails and calls started coming in, not to Omnigen, but to Ms. Alvarez's small office above the bakery. They were inquiries, questions about the provenance of the Vance landrace variety. They were looking for their next move, and they sensed that the future of resilient corn genetics wasn't in Omnigen's sterile labs, but in my dusty seed bank. They weren't coming to me because I was poaching them. They were coming because their business depended on legitimate, defensible science, and they could smell the fraud clinging to Omnigen like a disease. The foundation was cracking, and the rats were smart enough to flee. The final confrontation wasn't in a courtroom, under the dramatic glare of fluorescent lights. It was in a sterile, beige conference room at a neutral law firm in the city. A place with no history and no soul. It was a place of surrender. Omnigen had requested the settlement meeting. Their entire legal team was there, a row of expensive, exhausted-looking suits. Sterling Thorne sat at the head of the table, but he wasn't in command. He looked smaller, diminished, the sharp edges of his arrogance blunted by fear. He didn't look at me. Ms. Alvarez sat beside me, calm and composed. Arias was with us, not as a witness, but as a silent partner, his presence a testament to the scientific truth that had brought us all to this room. Their lead lawyer, a man who had probably billed $1 million to this case already, cleared his throat and began. He slid a folder across the polished table. It was their settlement offer, a public retraction of their lawsuit, a formal, albeit carefully worded apology for the misunderstanding, and a check with an obscene number of zeros on it. It was enough money to buy my farm 10 times over. Mrs. Alvarez didn't even open the folder. She pushed it gently back across the table. "My client is not interested in your money, gentlemen," she said, her voice quiet but filling the entire room. A wave of confusion, then panic, washed over their faces. Sterling Thorne finally looked up, his eyes wide. "We have our own terms," Miss Alvarez continued. She produced a single sheet of paper. First, the patent. U.S. Patent 9876, 543. We are not asking for it to be invalidated. We are demanding it be reassigned. She let that sink in. The lawyers exchanged horrified glances. The primary inventor will be posthumously and publicly credited as Alara Vance. Her name will be on the patent. The ownership of said patent will be transferred, in its entirety, not to Lynette Vance, but to a new entity, the Vance Heritage Seed Trust. I had spent weeks with Ms. Alvarez and Eris designing this. The trust would be a nonprofit foundation. Its mission was to protect and preserve agricultural biodiversity. The genetic material from my family's seed bank, including the Solstice Queen and its stubborn gene, would be placed in the public domain, available to any and all researchers, breeders, and farmers who wish to use it. We were not taking their patent to enrich ourselves. We were taking it to liberate it. Second, Miss Alvarez went on, her tone like chipping ice, Omnigen will fund the initial endowment of the Vance Heritage Seed Trust with a one-time, unrestricted grant. The amount is non-negotiable. She slid our paper across the table. The number on it was not a settlement. It was a reparation. It was precisely calculated to match Omnigen's gross profits from all Titan VII-related sales and licensing for the past decade. And third, she said, her eyes locking onto Sterling Thorne's, you will issue a press release, drafted by us, detailing the full story. The bioprospecting of Dr. Marcus Thorne, the use of the samples from the Vance farm. You will correct the historical record. You will tell the truth. The room was utterly silent. We had them. They could refuse, of course, but their only alternative was to proceed with the lawsuit and the USPTO review, where all of this information would become public record in a far more humiliating and legally damaging way. A fraud conviction at the patent office would not only invalidate the Titan VII patent, but it would call into question every other patent they held. It would be a corporate death sentence. Our settlement wasn't a negotiation. It was the terms of their survival. Sterling Thorne looked at his lawyers, searching for an escape that wasn't there. He looked at me, his expression a toxic cocktail of hatred and defeat. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to his counsel. It was over. The news broke a week later. The press release, printed verbatim in major financial and agricultural journals, sent a shockwave through the industry. The story was even more damning than they could have imagined. Agrigiant Omnigen seeds foundational patent to family farmer in historic settlement. It detailed the theft, the fraudulent procurement, the cover-up. Omnigen's stock didn't just fall, it cratered. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Sterling Thorne was fired. His name, once a symbol of corporate power, became a cautionary tale. I didn't celebrate with champagne. I celebrated by walking through my fields at dusk. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and growing things. Araz was with me, and we stood for a long time in silence, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. The farm was safe. The legacy was secure. But it was more than that. We hadn't just won a victory for one farm. We had established a new precedent. We had proven that the roots of innovation often lie not in sterile labs, but in the patient, generational work of those who tend the earth. My new reality wasn't one of quiet retirement. The barn, the one where I had felt such profound despair, was now a bustling hub of activity. Contractors were carefully renovating it, transforming it into the headquarters of the Vance Heritage Seed Trust. My new throne wasn't a corner office. It was the old, scarred oak table from my kitchen, moved into the center of the barn, covered in maps, seed catalogs, and grant applications from universities and research groups around the world. We were building something new, something that would grow and share, not hoard and control. The silence of my victory was now filled with the noise of creation. I was standing in the half-finished office, a dusty beam of afternoon light illuminating the space, when a package arrived. It was long and flat. I opened it. Inside was a newly framed copy of the reassigned patent, and at the top, in crisp, bold letters, was her name, Alara Vance. I ran my fingers over the glass, over the name of the woman I had never met, but whose strength and wisdom had reached across a century to save me. My great-grandmother. The source. The power. This was my vindication. Not the money, not the firing of Sterling Thorne, but this simple, profound correction of the record. This was the harvest. They thought they could erase my family's history from the very land we had bled and sweat and wept into for over a century. They thought a piece of paper, a patent, was a weapon powerful enough to sever roots that deep. But a patent is just a story, a claim on an idea. And what their lawyers in their glass towers could never understand is that I had the original manuscript, written in soil and seed and sunlight. This was never about revenge. I know people will say that, watching a giant fall. But it's the truth. Revenge is a fire that burns you as much as your enemy. This was about something quieter, something more fundamental. It was about reclaiming the truth. It was about balance. They had taken something that wasn't theirs, and the world had been knocked off kilter. My fight was simply to set it right again. It was about ensuring that the real work, the patient, observant, generational work of cultivation and discovery, is honored, not paved over by the arrogance of corporate greed. They thought innovation was something you could invent in a sterile lab and lock away with a legal fence. They forgot that true innovation is a conversation with nature, one that my family had been a part of for 4 generations. So I stand here now, in this old barn being given a new life, and I look out at the fields my family has tended for all these years. The farm is not just mine anymore. It belongs to a larger idea now. Its legacy is secure, not because I won a fight, but because I was able to share its gift. My story is my own, but I know the feelings are universal. To be overlooked, to be underestimated, to have your contributions erased by those who are louder and more powerful. It's a feeling that can grind you down to dust if you let it. But what I've learned is that truth has a weight and a gravity all its own. It can be buried for a long time, but it can't be destroyed. And sometimes all it needs is one person, stubborn enough to stand their ground, to help it find its way back to the light. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt small against something big and unmovable, I want you to know you're not alone. Please, let me know in the comments. Hearing your stories, knowing that this isn't just my fight, it helps more than you can imagine. Like this video if it gave you a little bit of strength today. Share it with someone who might need to be reminded that the deepest roots can withstand any storm. And please, hit that subscribe button and join me. We have a lot more stories to tell and a lot more ground to reclaim together.